All right, boils and ghouls. After a much needed few week break, it is great to be back to talk some more horror movies. And figured I wanted to start with one that I feel doesn't get a lot of love nowadays, even though this was a huge movie when this came out in 2001. The Others with Nicole Kidman, which I think this is one of her best performances. If you haven't seen this movie for some reason, 20 something years later, brief synopsis before we go full on spoilers here. Grace, played by Kidman, is a devout Christian mother who has her two kids, Anne and Nicholas, who have this disorder, disease that they're photosensitive, that they can't be in the sunlight, and they live in this mansion and they start to experience paranormal, supernatural type activity. That's basically all you need to know. I mean, I don't know how anyone hasn't seen this movie or hasn't seen a parody of it in some way that they wouldn't know this movie at all. Like if you mention The Others to somebody, I don't know many people that are horror fans especially that would say, I've never heard of that movie. I have no idea what it's about. So if you haven't seen The Others for some reason, check it out. It is a very, very atmospheric movie. There isn't a lot of jump scares like in modern haunting movies and ghost flicks. There's not a lot of stuff that you really see, even compared to a lot of those aforementioned more modern movies. But there's a great feeling of just unease and just this weird, mysterious feeling that builds throughout this movie to the reveal, which most people know the twist of this movie. And I don't know if it's been done before this. As I say with every premise, it probably has been. But the fact that we're spending the whole movie with this family that ends up being the ghosts involved in this haunting scenario we see playing out in this movie. This is the movie I think of. Like, if anyone mentions that trope of, oh, they're the ghosts and they're the ones that are causing the haunting, this is the movie I think of as The Others. So, like I said, has it been done before this? I'm sure it's been done many, many times. But they do it very, very well here, to the point that it was very, very original for the most part back when it released in 2001. I remember when this movie came out, I saw this in theaters. This blew a lot of people away. It wasn't something that you saw often, especially at that time. So let's jump into The Others from 2001. So it's 1945, Jersey, not shithole New Jersey, Jersey, Channel Islands in the UK. And we see Grace waking up from a nightmare. So she wakes up, and then we see Mrs. Mills. Lydia is the mute one, and Mr. Tuttle. The fact that they're all British and speak British, I mean, that adds something to it just for me, for personal reasons. And clever idea of making them photosensitive so that throughout this whole movie, it's darkly lit. And there's an explanation for it. Clever. And that's one thing, like I said, that this movie is just excellent at, is the atmosphere. So that's a cool little detail they threw in there that also helps add to why it's dark all the time. And the kids are adorable in this movie, and the dialogue between them. The daughter Anne knows that the father is going to come home from the war, and the son, sometimes doubts it. All of their bickering back and forth is so authentic feeling. And Mrs. Mills is a great character. I mean, all the performances are great in this movie. Also, I've said in videos, movies that revolve around religion heavily, like The Exorcist and The Omen, and that since I'm not really religious, those themes don't really do much for me. But I don't know, as I watch this and seeing how religious they are and stuff like that, for some reason, and this happens with other movies too, I feel like maybe it affects me a little bit, just in the area of you better pray that you're right in not believing in this shit, because if the world comes to an end and you're wrong and all of this is true and you defected for no reason, then you just picture the world ending. I'm getting fucked in the ass by an angel descended from heaven or something for all eternity for not believing. And then we got our little first clue here from Anne to Mrs. Mills when she says that you'll leave us.
Why should I leave you?
The others said they wouldn't, but they did. And then it happened. Be quiet.
What happened?
Mummy went mad. Nothing happened. Yes, it did. No, it didn't. Yes, it did.
Be quiet.
So that's our first little clue that something happened in the past, that their mom lost her mind in some way and did something. You don't know what exactly at this moment, but that's your first little hint. And I'm going to mostly not talk about the twist until we get to that point in the movie, just so to keep it less confusing. Then we get the little Bible study scene with Grace and the kids. And these kids are smart. They're not stupid. Anne says, and they get scolded for it. And let me say, man, Grace, this mother, she is terrifying. She could really scare the shit out of you. Being a young kid of their age, with all the religious bullshit she goes into afterwards, with where kids who lie go, they go to hell, one of the 4 different hells, all that stuff. But Anne says that she wouldn't have been stupid like the kids in the story they're reading in the Bible, and said that they believed in God and got killed for it. They would have still believed inside, but they wouldn't tell the Romans that. And that's called being smart and wanting to survive. And then they get chewed out for that, because then they would end up going to child purgatory, basically, for limbo, for lying and denying Christ and all that bullshit. But it's a great scene. Then Anne ends up going to a different room. They get separated. Then we get our first bit of ghostly activity, where Grace hears crying. And first she runs to Nicholas, and he's reading, he's fine. Then she runs up to Anne, and she's fine. And she says, who was crying? And she starts saying that it was this kid Victor that Anne's been seeing. And some of the stuff she says is just hilarious. Like, I think he's a spoiled brat. The way she says it. Then she gets ripped a new asshole for lying, even though she's not. And Grace notices that the door is unlocked and open. And it's supposed to be locked, because she has this rule that she told Mrs. Mills and Lydia and Mr. Tuttle. Every room that they enter, they have to close and lock the previous door, because, you know, the kids having light pussy, that they're light pussies. They're pussies when it comes to handling light. So the door was left unlocked and open. So she starts grilling Mrs. Mills, and they kind of infer that maybe she forgot herself, Grace, and she flips even more. I'm telling you, she's terrifying, this mom. See, this scene right here is what I mean about this movie with the atmosphere, and how it doesn't have to show much to really creep you out. Where it's nighttime, and Anne and Nicholas are in their bedroom. Nicholas is trying to sleep, and he wakes up in the middle of the night, and the curtains are open. No threat to them because it's nighttime out. But Anne's saying it's Victor, and he's been doing it all night. And then she says, take a look at Victor. And he looks over in the area that Victor's supposed to be in. We don't see anything. And then he turns around and gets scared. And then she starts having a conversation with Victor, and you hear Victor's voice. But again, we don't see anything. And then she says to Victor to touch Nicholas's cheek, so he knows that he's really there. And then we just see the hand come and touch his cheek, and Nicholas obviously freaks the fuck out. And Grace hears them all screaming, but we easily could have just had a stupid jump scare thrown in there or a spooky face for Victor. No, it's very restrained and it's really creepy just the way it is. And it just relies on the atmosphere that builds throughout the scene. And I always forget the director's name because it's some foreign last name that I can't pronounce. But he does an excellent job directing here. And he also did the score for this too. And the score is very good too. I love the argument between Grace and Anne. The way that Anne goes up against her mom and kind of one-ups her at the end. But something, again, it's British. It's the way they're talking. But the way that she says to her mom after Grace says, "You told your brother there was somebody else in that room." And she says, "There was." And she says to Anne, "What did I tell you yesterday, whatever, about kids who go to limbo?" And then she one-ups her mom and says, "Well, I read that only kids who haven't been baptized go to limbo, and I have been baptized." And then it just cuts to the next scene after, like, Grace is in shock from her answer. That's great. Also, what adds to the creepiness a bit is the fact that this is also a period piece, and a very good one at that. This mansion looks spectacular. The set dressing, and so everything that they did to bring this place to life and make it as creepy as they did, excellent job. And the fog outside and the exterior shots of the place, very, very good cinematography and camera work in this movie too. This is such an underrated movie. Then another great scene where we don't see much again, but it's just all the implication and the sound design, which is great in this movie too. Grace starts hearing sounds again, and she goes upstairs, and Anne's been punished for like 3 fucking days for telling the truth about this kid Victor being in the room that night. So she's been punished. So she doesn't want to say the truth. She doesn't want to say anything because either way she's going to get punished in her eyes. And her mom says to her, "Is there somebody here?" And she says, "Oh, like I said, I don't know what to say." She says, "Just tell me the truth." And she says, "There, in that junk room." She ends up going into the room, and you hear whispers saying like, she's a woman, she's a woman. And Grace is hearing these whispers, and she starts taking the like sheets off of all the furniture and the decorations in that room. And now she knows there's definitely people in this house, but she can't see them. Anne can, because then Grace runs out of that room and says, "Where are they?" And Anne says, "They just went down there. They said that this house is theirs." And she says, "They're over there, there, oh, and over there. Mom, they're everywhere." So Anne can see them fully. Grace hasn't reached that point yet. Then she convenes with everyone in the house, with Mrs. Mills, and says that 5 years I've been able to keep a single Nazi from entering this house, and now there are people in this house opening and closing doors and sneaking about right under my nose. How is this happening? And she's not thinking ghosts at this point. She just thinks there's people, fucking around in her house, I guess. I love how Anne describes ghosts in this movie twice, as they go about in white sheets and moan and carry chains. That's cute. So Grace and Mrs. Mills and everybody, they search the whole house. They don't find anything. But Grace finds this book that has, those old school photographs that they would take when people were dead. And, they were dead portraits, basically. They would get the bodies together, either in bed or sitting up on the couch, and take the pictures of the recently deceased. They were all either in bed or on couches, stuff. Not me. If they still did that, I would want my corpse mounted on top of like a mastodon, and have me just like with a javelin in my corpse hand. Snap the photo right there, Chief. That would be perfect for my death book. But she finds this book, and obviously it does creep her out, as it would with anybody. And she tells Mrs. Mills to get rid of it. Also, I do like the subtle clue that we get in the dialogue from Mrs. Mills when Grace says that the book of the dead with all the pictures is macabre. Who would keep something like this or do something like this? And she says that grief over the loss of a loved one could lead someone to do the craziest of things, madam. Alluding to what we find out at the end of this movie, that over the loss of her husband in the war, she ended up killing her kids, Anne and Nicholas, and shooting herself in the head. But we'll get there with the twist. But nice little subtle nod to that. Then we get a great scene with Mrs. Mills talking to Grace. And Grace is trying to figure out what exactly led to Lydia not speaking. And Mrs. Mills is kind of skirting around giving a full answer. And she's talking about, her time when she used to work here. There was like 15 servants. Then there was only just the three of them. I'm guessing she means Lydia herself and Mr. Tuttle. And then mentions that it was during the tuberculosis outbreak, which later when we find out that they're all dead, it's the tuberculosis that killed them. I don't think they outright say that, but I mean, that's what's heavily implied right here in this scene. And I'm pretty sure Lydia stopped talking just when she discovered that she was dead and she was a ghost. Then you have just more great acting from Kidman when Grace goes upstairs and the kids are sleeping, and while Anne's sleeping, she leans on her and she asks, "Can you ever forgive me? I was too hard on you." Then Nicholas wakes up and asks when their father's coming home and why do you go to war. Then we see her on her own crying and asking where her husband is. All of that's great. I mean, she was nominated for a Golden Globe for this movie. Didn't win. Pretty positive she didn't win, but she was nominated. Then we have the piano scene, which we know Victor's father plays the piano. He's a professional pianist, and gathered that little bit of intel earlier on in the movie from Victor. And we hear the piano being played, and Grace wanders into that room. And then as soon as she opens the door to go into the room, it stops. And then she locks the piano up, and then she gets pushed by the door out of the room. Then Mrs. Mills comes and she goes in the room and the piano's unlocked and back open, and now she's starting to believe that there's something not at rest in this house, is how she puts it. Now, this is the part of the movie that I don't fully understand how this all works, because Charles, Grace's husband, father of the kids, ends up coming home. And obviously he's dead, and this is his ghost. And very touching scenes when the kids see him and wake up and they see their father. I mean, great stuff. Really tugs at the heartstrings. But how is this all working? Because the family's dead. Grace and the kids. Everyone in this house is dead. Mrs. Mills, all of them. So is it just his ghost showing up before they find out the truth about themselves? Or is it just a group delusion that they're all seeing the ghost of Charles? Like, I don't know how that all works. I don't know if I'm supposed to be looking that deep into it, but everything else makes sense about the reveal we get in a bit. So I never really understood how this works with Charles showing up for a bit, because then he ends up leaving just as fast as he showed up, and says that the war is still going on even though it's not, and he just disappears and he's gone. Then we get the most famous scene in this movie. This is one of those movies that was spoofed in the Scary Movie franchise, but this one for me, thankfully, didn't stick that much, so I could not see the Scary Movie reference and parody when I watch the actual movie here, if that makes sense. Like, when I watch some of the other movies that Scary Movie has parodied, like Scream or I Know What You Did Last Summer or stuff, all I could see is the Scary Movie stuff like with, I don't know the character's name is Scream 2, but when she gets killed in the movie theater at the beginning, and Brenda's character in Scary Movie, and they're all clapping and stuff. That's all I see if I ever throw Scream 2 on. This scene with Anne with her little gown on and she's playing with the puppet, and Grace comes in and she's humming and she's asking, "Where's my daughter?" And then she sees the old woman's face instead of her daughter's. And she says, "Are you mad? I am your daughter." And she attacks her, and then it turns out being her daughter. It's still really creepy. It aged pretty well. And that's what I mean. I could watch it and not immediately see Michael Jackson underneath there and whatever he says in whatever Scary Movie that is. 3, I think, maybe. Oh, yeah, man, that scene really does hold up well. It really creeps you out. I mean, imagine if you walked in and it's your daughter, and then you notice her hand is old and wrinkly, and you come around and you see through the veil of the gown she's wearing, you see an old woman's face instead of your daughter, but she's talking like your daughter. It's so fucking eerie, and she just attacks her. And then it turns out being her daughter. And she even says to Mrs. Mills, like, she won't stop until she kills us. She won't stop. Like, you're wicked. And to her mom, and she's being taken away. Further alluding to what we find out happened to them. And Grace even gets to fuck Charles, her ghost husband, before he departs again. So again, if someone knows the rules of how the whole Charles showing up and then leaving thing works, let me know. So Grace ends up hearing the screams of her children. They wake up with sunlight just shining into their room. The curtains have been taken down all over the house. And that brings me to a point, because then Mrs. Mills and Mr. Tuttle, and Lydia obviously doesn't speak, but the two of them are like fucking with Grace and saying like, "Oh, how do you know they're not cured? If you haven't exposed them to any sunlight, how would you know if the condition was, worsened or gone, or, stuff like that." So that brings me to the point of, did they really have a condition? Or is Grace just, kind of fucking nuts as we know her to be? I mean, she ended up killing her kids and stuff. So was that always just something that was in her mind? Or did she actually have doctors come and like diagnose her kids with an actual illness? She brings it up briefly at the very beginning, like something about the doctor, but I forget what she says. But that's all we really hear about it. So could the whole photosensitivity thing that her kids suffer from just be in her mind, and she's been raising her kids to think the same thing? Let me know. But then she ends up firing Mrs. Mills, Lydia, and Mr. Tuttle as they leave and get outside. Mrs. Mills says, "I'm at the end of my tether. It's about time we go uncover the gravestones." Then we get the first reveal, the obvious one, and at the exact same time, the children find Mrs. Mills, Lydia, and Mr. Tuttle's graves while they're out gallivanting on the property at night. Same exact time that Grace finds the envelope with the picture of the three of them dead. Thought it was funny that the kids and Grace at the exact same moment came to the same realization. But then the three of them show up. Mrs. Mills says to Grace after she shoots at her twice that the tuberculosis finished us off nearly half a century ago or something like that. So they do directly address it. And it's a really cool shot with the three of them, Mrs. Mills and the gang, at the door. And they're locked out and they can't get in the house, but they have like the moon shining and stuff behind them. That's a cool shot. And they're trying to explain to her and say, we all have to live together, the living and the dead. Then we see Nicholas and Anne upstairs in the closet, and the old woman finds them, and she hears her kids screaming upstairs, and Mrs. Mills says, "Nothing we can do now. They found them. You have to go upstairs and talk to them." Which brings us to the grand reveal that Grace, Anne, and Nicholas are dead, and they are, in fact, the ghosts, along with, I guess, Mrs. Mills, Lydia, and Tuttle, that are haunting this house that is occupied by Victor, his parents, and the old woman who is like a medium. And they're doing the seance, and that's where we find out that Grace, in all the grief of losing her husband Charles in the war, snapped and smothered her children with a pillow, then shot herself and took her own life. Now, I'm guessing that the very beginning of this movie starts with her waking up, as I said, and like having a nightmare, like she gets startled and wakes up in the middle of the night. I'm guessing that's right after she killed herself and the kids, right? Then that kickstarts the events of the movie. So we're seeing everything right after that event happened, because she says that after she did it, she thought God gave her another chance because she woke right back up and she saw her kids were alive, like nothing ever happened. So I'm guessing that her waking up is what we see at the beginning of the movie. Let me know your thoughts on that. And then we see reality and Victor's family and Victor's mother. She's like, no, we're good with this house. I want to leave immediately. Like, who knows the effect this is having on Victor? She's seen this ghost girl many times, and we know that the woman here went mad and killed her children and then shot herself, and that's all I need to know. I want to get out of here. And Victor's father agrees, and they end up leaving the house. And then they have the other famous scene at the end here where Grace is telling her kids what happened and basically recounting how she killed them, which, I mean, it's really eerie. And they end up repeating over and over again, this house is ours, this house is ours. So I guess the three of them and Mrs. Mills, Lydia, and Mr. Tuttle will be a nice happy family, and anybody else who comes along and buys this house, they'll get haunted by the six of them. Or maybe they'll actually take Mrs. Mills' advice and try to, live together, the living and the dead. We never got the others two, so we'll never find out. And also, the light doesn't affect the kids anymore. Like I said, whether it did in the first place or not, but now it definitely doesn't, so they could haunt in the light and the darkness all that they want. But excellent movie that I keep saying is very underrated. It was big when it came out, and I feel like it doesn't get a lot of praise nowadays. I would put this up with like top 10 haunting films or ghost films or haunted house films of, like post 2000s. I'd put this in my top 10. It would be high up on that top 10, like, or I should say low on the top 10 in the upper numbers, but it would be on that list. I think this is an excellent haunted house movie with a great twist, and it holds up 20 something years later. I mean, it's been a long while since I've seen this movie, but it's still just as entertaining and suspenseful as the first time I watched this in theaters. So that's the others, and next one will either be Shutter Island or Split. Those are the other two movies that I had in mind. I put the poll up. I have Split leading by a large amount. That's why I didn't do it first. I always go against the grain, whatever it is. So Split's winning, so maybe Split will be next. We'll see. But I hope everybody's having a great morning, afternoon, or night. I will talk to you soon. Take care, everybody.